Hello and welcome back, and today I want to talk about the Synology NVMe SSD series. Now this is, right now for me, part 2 in my series of videos that I'm filming, but I've got plans for 4 or 5 parts of tests on these SSDs in a number of ways, and they may go out in a different order. So I apologise if I refer to things that haven't happened or don't refer to things that have. But today we are looking at SSD caching in a virtual machine environment. So what that means is the benefits of SSD caching on any Synology NAS are pretty clear indeed, but unlike the audio quality on this, some of those differences aren't immediately apparent. And I do want to talk about audio quality because yes, I am well aware of the humming in the background during the course of this video. I am taking advantage of the relatively new SNV3400 rack mount from Synology because I wanted to make sure to use a device that could give me a suitable amount of storage as well as a suitable amount of power for me to assign to a virtual machine. So unfortunately there is going to be that humming noise in the background because it's a very powerful rack mount server and this is quite a contained environment. I've tried my best to limit the background noise, but it is near enough impossible when trying to control that level in the background, and it is a variable audio. So for those that have told me that I can just remove it with dynamic range compression, you will be surprised how little that will work. So why am I running this test today? Well, one of the things about SSD caching, which everyone, and I include Synology in this, have difficulty showing end users, is the practical real-world advantages. SSD caching will benefit the majority of users when accessing their NAS. Although the majority of the benefits are in smaller files rather than the large, the benefits of SSD caching are generally felt more than seen. They are areas of where the intrinsic abilities of the IOPS performance that SSD gives you and the increases presented to you by them, which are far faster than that of traditional hard drives, are bestowed in a smaller degree to hard drives. So you get hard drives which will generally have a lower IOPS performance, be given the benefits of the high IOPS presented by SSDs in the area of background caching. But it is displaying that information where things get tough, because people can use tools like IOmeter, Atto Benchmark, and those are tools we'll be looking at today. But a lot of those times, those aren't really real-world examples. You're not going to be using these tools every day. You're going to be running live backups. You're going to be synchronizing with Synology Drive. You're going to be running surveillance. You're going to be running virtual machines. So these series of videos are about showing you guys the benefits of SSD caching in more relatable ways, in ways that you can understand rather than being told it's X thousand IOPS per second. So with this, let's move forward. I have set up a virtual machine on this NAS. It is a 6-core VM, and I've put 8 gig of DDR4 memory onto it. So it's quite a good VM there, and it is a standard Windows VM. There you can see the IPs there, it's VM test 1, this is the VM. Now, I've already assigned SSD cache to the storage pool on this NAS. The storage pool is taking advantage of UltraStar drives, and I've got all of these lovely UltraStar drives all in a RAID 0 environment. So them on their own should be giving us a huge amount of performance. Obviously that performance is going to be somewhat cut down by a virtual machine, which is given an area of hardware to take advantage of. In this case, this VM has 2 terabytes of storage inside, and it takes advantage of 6 of the available 12 cores and 8 gig of the available 16 gig memory. So things have to be scaled to a VM. Now, I've already ran the SSD cache for quite a long time, and it has in the background created a lovely pool of cache of all of the internal files on this NAS, and that includes the virtual machine as well, but of course all the core files within the system. And I am taking advantage of those brand new SNV3400 Synology SSDs. Why would people go for them? Well, first and foremost, sustained IOPS performance over the duration of their lifespan, and they use the TLC 3D NAND, which again will help endurance moving forward. These are the SSDs that are designed primarily and only for caching. You can't take advantage of them in a standard storage capacity. and they do leverage read rather than write. They do have good write figures, but there's no avoiding that both in terms of IOPS and to standard read-write performance, they are heavily in favour of read, which makes them very, very good for caching, as well as a lifetime expectancy, that 5-year endurance factor, where the IOPS, they state, will not dip significantly over the duration of that lifespan. Now, it's going to be harder to show that in any test moving forward, but in today's video we're going to run a few performance benchmark tests within this VM, like we would on a desktop PC, on a system that has SSD caching enabled. Then I'm going to remove the cache, obviously powering down the VM first, and then I'm going to reboot the VM without the cache and run the same tests, and then see what the performance difference is within a VM in terms of that, in terms of with and without SSD caching. Now, normally I would run the test without caching first, but because of the time it takes for SSD caching to build, because the actual installation of SSD cache takes me a minute, but the analysis of your system is what takes a little bit longer, and to see what files you've got and how you use them. So I've decided to do the area of this test with the cache first, and then I'll remove the cache. Future videos coming up soon will be 10 GBE testing, and we're going to be doing some testing with Synology Drive. But without further ado, let's go forward with things. Let's go straight into Atto Benchmark first. Open up Atto Benchmark within the VM, and what we're going to run is a 1 gig test file within the VM utilizing Atto Disk Benchmark. Let's open up the task manager as well. While we do it, let's take a little look at the performance as we go. So let's have a look there, move that to one side within the VM window. And again, I am using screen recording software, so this may affect what we see on screen a little bit there. There might be a drop in frame rates and stuff like that. Let's get the resource monitor up there, bring those out. Let's bring the disk and talk about what's being utilized. Actually, we're probably better off with the previous tool. Let's go back to that one, because we've got to try and get as much information on screen in a legible fashion as possible. And obviously we want to look at disk utilization probably more than anything, because that's the one where we're going to be looking at what this can do. Let's full screen that. Let's bring in Atto there as well. And let's go ahead and begin our test. So this is a 1 gig test file. We're going to be looking at read and writes, but we're also going to be looking at IOPS afterwards. And then we're going to run some tests on a slightly smaller file, just 3 tests on that one. So let's go ahead and run the Atto Benchmark test. Okay, so the first test has concluded. As we can see here, the 1 gig test file is done. If we scroll down the bottom here, we can see that we were crossing into the 1 gigabyte per second there. And of course, that is because we are using a system that is taking advantage of both traditional hard drives in a RAID 0, so 10 of them, as well as the SSD caching, helping things moving forward. Now, we could see a lot of those speeds throughout, and you probably saw me readjusting the screen as the test started. Don't worry, we will keep it in this framework for the rest of the video. And if we look at the IOPS, that's quite an interesting area as well. We can take a look there at the IOPS, and we can see there we were getting quite close there to the 10, but for the most part we capped out early doors at about 8,000 or so, which again, with hard drives, is fairly standard, but it's going to be interesting to see how much of the SSD cache we were utilizing to leverage that. So also, I'm going to take a very quick screenshot here for us to utilize later, because that's going to be quite handy for running comparisons later on. So I'm going to pop that over there. And I think what we should do now is, now we've seen this information, is run a second test, this time taking advantage of a 1/4 of a gig size file, so a much smaller file there, and we'll run that test for a second time. And this time, as I say, we will go ahead and run that test there. There we are. Now, as it does that in the background, I'm just going to go ahead and save that screen grab that we've just captured on the other side of the screen there. Got a dual screen setup running. And what's going to be interesting to see is how these two compare. So I'm just going to go ahead and save that file there. So let's call that one 1 gig. It's going to fast forward now. Right, so we finished the second barrage of tests there, and once again the read figures do seemingly appear higher. So on the background here, if we go ahead and move the old results from earlier, we can take a look at those IOPS from the previous test. Switch back to that VM, go back into the IOPS figures there, and we can see how those two figures compare. So again, we did see higher performance, I would say, overall in the previous test. There was a slight dip there, but overall it's still pretty much of a muchness if we look between them. Similarities there with the gutter balling happening just a fraction different there. If we look at the 1 meg there, we're still at 1K at 1 meg. So again, very similar figures indeed. Right, so for the next part of the testing, we're going to make a switch over to IOmeter, and I know a number of you again, not overly au fait with IOmeter. It's one of those very techie programs that's been around for a long time for measuring IOPS, and I know I said I was going to avoid programs like this, but I do think I would have to at least give it a nod in this. We're going to make sure to set up one worker. We're going to go ahead and set it up on the local disk. We're going to go ahead with, which of the tests should we go for before we start setting this up? We're going to go with a 100% read and 100% random test there. We're going to maybe run it for 60 seconds in the background, and we have to make sure that we go ahead and ensure that we're seeing all the results we want to see. So updating every second. Got to remember to sort out the sectors as well. We're going to go for an 80 megabyte test file, maybe an 80 gig even, and make sure none of it's living in the cache. Going to run the test for 60 seconds. Ramp up time of 5 seconds. There in the background. Got that set up. We've got the percent frequency next. We're going to make sure we see the IOPS read versus IOPS write. Make sure we see that, although the figures are obviously going to be remarkably one-sided there between them. Wrong one. Forgive me, the screen recording software in here is lowering my response time quite annoyingly. We're going to go for just standard, because we're not really looking at the generic read and write settings. And if we go ahead and start the test results there, run the setup, and boom, run the test now. Pop the results in the folder. It's ramping in, the file's ready, and we can go ahead and begin. So we're seeing those IOPS again around about 4,000, which is fairly standard for hard drives like this and this kind of RAID array, particularly within the VM environment. Do bear that in mind. That's going to be quite important indeed. And again, that test is going to run for 60 seconds. Again, you can ignore these settings down here, and do remember a lot of the time the figures you are seeing, they are being measured in bytes. So there's a lot of math going on in the background there that I recommend you check out. But again, we are not looking at standard read and write speeds. We are looking at those IOPS there on screen. Now, what I'm going to do while it does that is take just a standard screenshot there, because what we're going to do, as I say, we weren't really going to dwell too much on IOmeter in the grand scheme of things. IOmeter was really just to do it because it was there for most people, and a lot of you are going to be more concerned with more standard practices of their storage. So what I'm going to do now is shut that down, end that test, because we've got those there, and we've got the results again saved, which is always quite handy. Go ahead, make a little bit of space on the system. Get rid of that, empty the recycle bin there, which has got all the crap from earlier. And we'll make our way into something a little bit more basic. HD Tune, fantastically normal bench test software for testing read, write and access times here at the bottom. We're selecting the internal hard disk, and we can go ahead and start this operation. Now again, those that don't know, HD Tune's been around for a long old time. The speeds we're going to see from that are a little bit more relatable than those that we saw on Atto Disk Benchmark. They run a very different ship there, but do bear in mind HD Tune does have its limitations. And while that runs that in the background, I'm going to fast forward and get ready for the final part of part one of these tests. Right, so fairly standard stuff there, but it is of course worth highlighting that we're not really seeing the performance benchmarks that we saw earlier on because of HD Tune and the way its architecture is within a VM like this. Next, we want to have a look at AJA, and with AJA testing, this is a tool that we're a lot more familiar with. Again, we're going to be running within that one area there of the VM while it's running on the cache there in the background. Let's get rid of that and leave the cache back on screen. And again, we're going to make sure we don't have disk caching or anything enabled, so no disk caching there. It's a single test file running continuously with read-write performance. Click OK. It's a 1 gig test file. Let's go ahead and click. So again, some lovely numbers straight away, all internally. We're getting that 600, 700, 800 there. Lovely balance of read-write. But we are still seeing that occasional dip, as you would expect from a VM running across a RAID environment like this. I will say that read number has dipped a little bit, but again, we are using AJA in an unfamiliar environment. What we want to take from this is ultimately those overall scores over time, because this is kind of what we want to see. I'm going to get a good 10, maybe 15 seconds worth of recording there. Sorry about the performance dip. Remember, I am screen recording. And I think I'm going to end this on the AJA testing there. And then afterwards, what I'm going to do is power this device down, this VM at least, and then remove that SSD cache and repeat all of the tests that we've just performed, just to see what the difference is. Just to compare them against one another. So we're going to let that run for just a little bit longer. We've got those performance benchmarks there at the bottom. Still pretty lovely numbers there for a 2 TB RAID 0 of hard drives in a virtual machine. But let's end things right there. Let's click old stop there. And we're going to close that up and start powering down our VM. Now, bear in mind, when the VM is done, what I'm going to be doing, actually, why don't we just record my entire process? Because just setting up the VM on its own is not enough. Because once we've removed the cache, I want to make sure this VM is reset to exactly the way we found it at the beginning. So if we full screen here, we can see if we go into the Virtual Machine Manager that our VM is now powered off. But we don't just want to restart that VM because we don't know what's living in the cache of this VM. So what we're going to do is completely delete it, and then we're going to reinstate that VM from scratch, because that way it shows that none of the background testing that we performed up to this point is still living in the VM's own library and history. Oh, let's delete that there, maybe not include the caps lock. And while it does that, we're also going to head into the cache now and remove that area of cache. We're going to completely delete the cache from within inside the system. And this in turn, we've now deleted that virtual machine, as you can see. So the virtual machine is gone. And now in the background, the system is going to unmount the cache, which will then temporarily remove our storage pool as well. And then it will reinstate the storage pool without cache. And then from there, what I'm going to do in the Virtual Machine Manager tool is reinstate that VM. That VM comes from an image that was living on the main core system. So I'm going to reinstate that VM image, exactly the one that we were on before, and then run the same tests that we've just performed, only this time without SSD cache supporting the virtual machine, to see how they compare. Let's fast forward to the complete unmounting of SSD cache and the restoration of that VM. Right, so we've reinstated everything. We've got the VM back up here on screen. It's exactly the same VM. If we go into the individual settings, we can see that virtual machine. And again, this is a virtual machine that we had already on an image here, ready to go, a disk image that we reinstated, exported in, and it's this brand new one. It's still 8 gig, it's still using the same BIOS, it's still 6 cores of memory, it's still the same network, it's still the same storage value. On top of that, while we're running it, we can have a look inside the storage manager. There's no SSD cache, as you can see there. Still using the same RAID 0 environment, this time with no caching enabled. And if we make our way into the resource monitor, we'll be able to take a good look at how much utilization there is of this VM throughout. It's still the same 6-core processor that we're running, and the same 8 gig of memory. And we've reinstated this VM, but this time I have made sure the screen is the right size for this test, rather than changing it midway through. Let's open up Atto Disk Benchmark there in the background. And again, we want to run that 1 gig test file there. Let's go for 1 gig down there. This time we want to primarily focus on IOPS as they cut through them. Same settings, same setup, same disk utilization. Let's have a look there and click start. So while it does that in the background, we're going to leave the resource monitor on the left hand side of the screen, and at the same time we're going to pull through those results from earlier. So while it does that on screen, I'm just going to get those results sorted out on my second screen, and we can take a good look here at what we're going to see. And already we're seeing those IOPS are a degree less than those featured on the 1 gig test earlier. So if we leave that there, we'll move that resource monitor up. We can take a good look at these benchmark performance. And we're already seeing, without the cache, the IOPS there have noticeably dropped, because the system is not able to take advantage of the IOPS that are presented to the VM. Now remember, even though a VM runs from an image, you're still using lots of core individual files on your system. And VMs are one of the keen ways in which a lot of users will feel the benefits. Now remember, we are looking at IOPS. We're not looking here much at read and write, although I'm sure with IOPS figures like that we will see a performance difference in between read and write and with caching and without. The reason I want to focus on IOPS is this is where you feel the difference, and feeling is that horrible immeasurable term, and it's ideally one of the main reasons why displaying IOPS, just showing the benefits of SSD caching, is so difficult, because SSD caching is about fluidity, and it's about small files being made available very quickly. In many ways, it's about that figure latency. And when you're doing things with your NAS, the speed at which tiny files are processed in the background can give you the difference in feeling between a local drive and a network drive. And somewhere between those, when you're accessing a NAS over the internet, you need to know that those background processes are done so quickly that you don't notice the difference. And that's what it keeps coming back to with caching. Now remember, this is the 1 gig test file. I think we're probably going to see even better performance when we make that switch down to the smaller capacity drive. But as you can see here, as we're around 2/3 of the way through this test, if we look at the 1 meg test file here, we can see it maxed at 965, and we can see the performance difference even carries lower and lower, although obviously the margin of improvement will lower throughout the testing in this system, where we have the cache here and on the right hand side the non-cache figure. And of course we will take a quick look at the read and write speeds. I don't have a screenshot of that, but again, it doesn't really matter for what we're doing, because read and write with regards to megabytes per second of caching versus non-caching, that's stuff we've done in other videos, and I've got loads of videos about that. Plus you'll probably see that difference when we run the AJA portion of the test later on. But I'm going to keep rabbiting now until this test ends so I can start the next test, and then we'll fast forward that one a little bit, because let's face it, you must be super bored of my voice by now. But still, we're seeing that decrease rapidly over time, but yet the figures are still consistently higher across the entire spectrum there of Atto disk benchmark. And if we look at the read and writes, I'll be surprised if we broke the gig, and we didn't break into the gigabytes per second. We're still in the megabytes there, and again, lower performance overall. So let's switch back to the IOPS, and this time we're going to look at that lower sized file there. If we go back, we'll get ready with the figures there for us to look at during the test. We're looking at the 256 megabyte test file there. Let's zoom in, get that ready, and again we'll make the switch to 256 megabytes for the Atto disk benchmark test, and let's run that test there in the background. And again, if we'd had a look while that runs that test, we can see the CPU utilization and memory obviously dipped. The good thing about Synology's virtual machine platform is it's quite smart in the way it allows CPU utilization to be shared. You can dedicate memory, as you can see there. We dedicated 8 gig of the available 16 gig on our Synology, but CPU utilization is shared, and disk utilization and volume utilization has been higher on this area than it was before. You're even seeing that performance there of the disks being lower overall, and a lot of that is to do with that added support of the background processes presented to the VM files. Not so much even just the core VM image. You're not really going to see it in a VM image because caching doesn't present that much of a benefit to large files. Stuff like watching 4K and stuff like that, you're not really going to see it. Big images, you're not really going to see it. Caching is about the small files. It's about all the little increment files in the background, and particularly if you're running multiple VMs from the VM software, caching will be hugely beneficial to everyone, as it's the VM core files that are supported and cached, not the big giant files. And also, if you run a VM environment where you clone VMs, so if you've got one core VM and then you make multiple clones for your staff or family or friends or whatever, that's another area where you will see a lot of benefit for SSD caching moving forward. So let's fast forward to the completion of the second round of Atto benchmark tests. And now the test is drawing to a close there. We can see that once again the figures are higher on the cached side of the VM utilization than we saw here in the non-cached version. And again, read and write speeds there, not great, not fantastic. Let's get rid of that test software there, get rid of that, all the stuff from before. But I think in terms of Atto benchmark, we are seeing definitely better performance overall with the caching enabled because of what's happening with the core background files. So now we're going to come out of Atto disk benchmark. Let's come out of it there, and this time we are going to look at IOmeter once again. We're going to go ahead and set up the identical test to the ones we saw earlier on, and we're going to see how they compare. So we've got IOmeter set up now. Once again, we're not using a network target, and we are going to go for 100% read, 100% random once again. Going to match all of those same parameters, same logical size. Going to go for that, keep that total IOPS. Going to make the switch there between read IOPS, second one write IOPS, so we can see between them. Pop that down there. And again, we're going to change that one to total read write, even though it doesn't matter too much. And we'll leave CPU utilization on there for now. And again, updating frequency of 1 second. And moving forward, we'll let it run for that 60-second total, that running in the background, and with a 5-second ramp up. So those are all of the settings. Let's go ahead and click there. Let's put that there, create the file, move that to one side, and get the disk drive running there in the background. It's preparing the drives. It's about to start the test, and we can see what we see this time around. We've got our ramp up. We saw about 4,000 last time, and as we can see now, we're just hitting the 3,000 mark there. So it is a dip of 1,000 IOPS per second there, but of course we are running a read-only operation, so as you can see, the write is rubbish. So we are already seeing that performance difference there with regards to having the IOPS, having the cache and not having the cache. And again, we aren't going to run the IOmeter test for too long. We did agree that that's hardly the most suitable test environment here. And again, after this, we are going to run that AJA performance desk mark there, because with AJA, it would be nice to see those read and write speeds, but we could do HD tune again, but I do think that wasn't really representative of what we're trying to do in these tests. But we can let that test now run out to its end, but it does look like we're not really going to hit over those 3,000 read IOPS there by comparison. So let's come out of IOmeter there. Let's go ahead and shut that one down. And of course now we'll switch to that AJA speed test. AJA, once again, we're running a 1 gig test file. We're running that core setting there. We double check. Still no caching enabled in the background. Still a single file. Still running continuously. A read-write test. Let's go ahead and see it. So again, now we're seeing that dip there around about the 360-400s. So we did see overall a better read-write performance within this VM. Now, those read-writes per second are, of course, relative. They're relative to this VM that we're running. They are relative to the hardware within this VM, and they are relative to the drives and media we have set up. So these are not indicative of the speeds you will see in your real-world environment. Also bear in mind that the SSD caching we are running was left to cache for quite a long time. We let the cache really analyze the entire database of this Synology NAS via the E10M20 T1 card and those two SNV3400 SSDs inside. But still, nevertheless, we are seeing arguably a more consistent read right here in the VM. It's definitely maxing out. You may have noticed when we did the AJA test of the VM with caching, the read and writes were far more erratic, I would say. They were still consistently higher than these numbers, but you could definitely see that the read-write activity was spikier. Sometimes we saw as high as 6, sometimes as low as 400, but it did flitter between them. So whether that's a good thing or a bad thing for you, I'm not sure, but I do think that's an observation that we should at least take note of. But I think I'm going to wrap things up here. I hope you guys have enjoyed this. I do hope this has displayed the performance benefits of the Synology SNV3400 NVMe SSDs. We will be performing 10 GBE NVMe SSD cache speed tests with this exact same setup, but this time on this NAS, instead of having all of those SSDs in a RAID 0, we're going to create 2 RAID 5s. So we're going to do a RAID 5 with 4 of these drives and a RAID 5 with the other 4 of the drives, but one of those RAID 5s is going to have caching on board. And we're going to be running tests over 10 GBE with a Windows system to this NAS to see what those performance benefits are, both with and without SSD caching. But thank you so much for watching. Hope you guys have enjoyed this video. Click like if you did, click subscribe if you want to learn more, and stay tuned for the next part in my series of tests utilizing these SSDs from Synology. I will see you next time.